Good evening, everybody. Welcome to session 3 of Stories of God, Stories of Race, and Stories of St. Mark's. My name is Lisa Melland, and I am the chair of the St. Mark's Racial History Task Force. We want to start this evening with a few announcements for housekeeping purposes. The first is that we are placing a hard stop on our proceedings at 6 p.m., a hard stop at 6 p.m. Going forward. And this is based on feedback from parishioners who participated in the plenary sessions and the house churches before Easter. There was a survey that they took, and so this is based on their feedback. So when you think about it, these sessions, if they took place in the 9 o'clock hour at the physical St. Mark's on a Sunday morning, there would have been a hard stop, and that would have been the Sunday service was beginning. So we're just mirroring that. And then I wanted to mention just project scope in general. The scope for our racial history task force's work is provided on a subsequent slide that Father Justin will be reading in a moment. And it's important that projects like this have a scope. It's very easy to go down a rabbit hole and invest 3 hours very unproductively. So, so we really have to know what it is we are seeking. And so we look for prevailing historic themes. We're looking for essentially horses, not zebras. And we believe that numbers tell a story. So, and also we are trying to bring forward some voices that aren't typically heard in this sort of narrative. So those are our goals when we do research. So with that said, we really applaud when you go deeper in your own personal research, and feel free to mention authors, books, and other schools of thought in the Q&A. Father Justin will follow up with you because he'd ideally like to be able to type into the chat either in that session or if there's a subsequent session, type into that chat the names of those authors and books and whatnot so that others can review them as well for their own information. And so with that, I want to do an introduction now into session number 3 that will take us into the American Revolution. But first, I actually want to take you back to that very first plenary session before Easter. Dr. Allison Grusecki was the featured speaker. And her, now we use an interlocking puzzle piece graphic that you'll see in a moment. She unfortunately didn't have that at the time, but if she had that and it were going into place and there were words spoken to that graphic, they'd be something like this. And I'm paraphrasing, okay, so I'm probably not doing it that well, so bear with me. Looking back at Old Testament times, there were warring armies, battles, and conflicts, unfortunately. Out of those conflicts would come a definite winner and loser. And I think of that expression, to the victor goes the spoils, that expression. Soldiers from the losing army might end up being enslaved by their conquerors, but their enslavement was not based on the color of their skin. It was based on who lost that battle or war. So enslavement then was not based on the color of one's skin. So in these sessions, we are explaining the transition that took place, how enslavement became based on the color of one's skin. And so I'm sorry we weren't able to get it done for this week, but Father Justin and I are going to work on a timeline to present next week that kind of shows the transition from what Dr. Grusecki was speaking about through to the end of session of this era 1. So with that, I will bring up the slides. So Father Justin, would you care to read the introduction, please?
Absolutely, thank you, Lisa. So we've tasked the Racial History Task Force with researching incidents of racial injustice, inequality, and inaction, and how St. Mark's in particular has both cooperated with and impeded the cause of racial equity and justice in both New Canaan and the broader community. And so we've got 3 eras into which we've divided our work. Right now we are in era 1, 1760 to 1880, roughly the pre-colonial period through the end of the Civil War. Back to you, Lisa.
Okay, thank you. And I want to remind you to look for these interlocking puzzle pieces flowing into place. Those are the moments when our task force has reached an important conclusion that we wish to share with you. And so now I want to share with you all a video. It's a 10-minute video about Captain Stephen Betts and Jesse Betts. And as you can see, it also features Father Justin at one point. And before I air it, I just want to say a word of thanks to Nick Ranieri, who's a parishioner at St. Mark's, who did an absolutely outstanding job of filming this and editing it to the completed state that you see here. So now I'm going to air this video. It's just going to play in this little section. If you want to go see it on your own, you can go into YouTube, type in into the search box, Stephen Betts and Jesse Betts, Stephen with a PH, not a V, and it will come up. So enjoy this video.
At the time, it seemed like the war would never end.
A Revolutionary War soldier and a patriot, Stephen Betts fought in battles up and down the eastern seaboard before being wounded at Yorktown. By his own account, Betts fought in 13 different battles, a feat matched by few soldiers of any rank during the war.
If you'd lend me your ear for just a moment, I'll tell you the whole story. I listened intently to the events of the battles of Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill from my hometown in Norwalk, Connecticut, the spring of 1775. Young and dedicated, I did not hesitate to enlist and aid the fight for American independence.
On July 6th, 1775, I was but 19 when I received the rank of sergeant in Captain Joseph Height's 4th Company in Colonel Charles Webb's 7th Connecticut Regiment. I joined recruits from Fairfield, Litchfield, and New Haven counties, stationed at various points along Long Island Sound, until September, when General George Washington ordered us to the Boston camps. I had recently become an ensign, along with my regiment, was closely engaged at the Battle of White Plains on October 28th and the Battle of Trenton on December 25th, 1776. Some in the regiment continued in service after their term expired at the request of General Washington and engaged at Princeton on January 1st, 1777. I was one of the honored few to be raised to the rank of captain. I was not even old enough yet. Commission didn't take place until my 21st birthday that July. The winter of 1777 to 78 was cold and harsh, but it did not break my spirit. It was that year at Valley Forge that I signed my loyalty oath. In that spring of 1778, while serving in the 2nd Connecticut Regiment of the Continental Line, I fought at the Battle of Monmouth. But it is my exploits in my own hometown, the Battle of Norwalk, that sit most prominently in my mind.
Major General William Tryon, Loyalist governor of New York, had been conducting retribution raids at New Haven and Fairfield further up the coast. They then retreated to their vessels and sailed across the Sound to Huntington Bay, Long Island. On the evening of July 10th, 1779, Governor Tryon led 2,600 British and Hessian soldiers to Norwalk. Their ships moored beyond the Norwalk Islands, and a division was transported by flatboats and bateaux to calf pasture where they camped for the night.
The townspeople were terrified of what might happen to them. Most fled north of the rocks to Belden Hill or other outlying areas during the night. Losses from the burning of Norwalk were staggering. 130 homes, 87 barns, 40 shops, 5 vessels, 2 churches, 4 mills and salt pans were burned that day by the British. Norwalk, a bustling mercantile center, suffered more destruction than any other Connecticut town during the Revolution. Now we had to win.
I went on to fight at the siege of Yorktown. and I was one of the commanders of the Forlorn Hope under orders from Colonel Alexander Hamilton. Everyone knew it was a suicide mission, hand-to-hand combat with no place to hide. On October 14th, 1781, I was wounded during a bayonet exchange, as my men and I took redoubt number 10. 5 days later, with success in hand, Cornwallis troops surrendered, signaling the end of the Revolutionary War.
We fought like lions, and we found our freedom.
Hi, I'm the Reverend Justin Crisp, and I'm an Associate Rector at St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut, a community which played an important role in Stephen Betts' life. Captain Betts was about my age, actually, when he returned from war to Norwalk, and 3 years later married Ruth Church. Stephen and Ruth became stalwart members of St. Paul's on the Green in Norwalk, actually, before moving sometime before 1790, several miles north to Canaan Parish, perhaps to acquire farmland. They settled on a farm on Owen Oak Ridge and had as many as 7 children, 3 of whom unfortunately died in childhood. Stephen Betts was a slave owner, and the Betts household included an enslaved African man named Jesse. Jesse was a farmer. We believe that Jesse served at least 2 generations of the Betts family. The 1850 census, taken after the deaths of both Stephen and his wife Ruth, lists Jesse Betts by name, and by that time as a free man of color in the household of Esther Raymond, Stephen's daughter, and her husband Lewis. In 1862, Jesse died at the age of 78 and was buried here in what's now the St. Mark's Cemetery on West Road, 2 graves down from Stephen's. The DAR and St. Mark's are both in the process of learning more about Jesse. We're committed to sharing more of his story and finding new ways to honor and memorialize him, particularly as St. Mark's and the whole Episcopal Church in Connecticut continue to explore our historic complicity in our nation's original sin. We also know that Captain Betts served alongside soldiers of color during the American Revolution. One such soldier was a black man by the name of Bristol Budd. By 1820, Budd was unfortunately blind, destitute, and in dire need of assistance. Because of Captain Betts' upstanding reputation as an officer, Bristol Budd traveled hundreds of miles, decades after the war, to seek him out and to ask him for help in securing a pension. The recommendation that Betts wrote for Budd was successful in garnering him a pension of $8 a month, giving Budd a livelihood when he needed it most, and also honoring his service as a patriot. Stephen Betts was a devout and devoted Anglican his entire life, and once he had settled on Owen Oak Ridge in New Canaan, he became a lay assistant at the Church of England Meeting House on West Road, which is where I'm actually standing now. This is where the meeting house was. After the Revolution, American Anglicans began to devise their own governance outside the jurisdiction of the Church of England, calling themselves the Protestant Episcopal Church. Betts actually helped to raise funds to build the first Episcopal church in New Canaan, known as St. Mark's, and he donated over 200 pounds of his own money towards the new church, built adjacent to God's Acre, where it still stands today actually as St. Michael's Lutheran Church. Captain Betts died on November 28, 1832, at 76 years old, just 2 years short of the building's completion. A bronze plaque still hangs at St. Mark's Church. It was originally dedicated to Captain Betts in the 1830s, and it stayed hanging in St. Mark's when the church relocated further up Owen Oak Ridge in the 1960s. The plaque names Captain Betts as one of our parish founders and as the first senior warden of the Episcopal Society in Canaan Parish. Captain Betts, his wife Ruth, their children, and Jesse are all buried here at the site of the old Church of England Meeting House on West Road, the entirety of which was converted to a cemetery when the congregation moved to God's Acre in 1833. Captain Betts embodied many of the most profound promises and perils of his generation, as even his burial here alongside Jesse indicates. We recognize and lament his inability to ensure freedom's extension to all in his household. even as we honor the valor with which he pursued the freedom of our young nation. It was only after the war that Captain Stephen Betts came to Canaan Parish, renamed New Canaan after its incorporation as a town in 1801. But both Norwalk and New Canaan remember and honor the bravery, mettle, and determination of this son of the American Revolution.
Wasn't that terrific? And many thanks again to Nick Ranieri. So I spent the better part of last summer doing research about Captain Stephen Betts for my local DAR chapter in New Canaan to be used by the DAR's America 250 committee. Our nation's 250th anniversary occurs in 5 years in the year 2026, and a national commission of national park officials, university presidents, and other dignitaries are making plans already as the America 250 Commission. A similar commission was set up prior to our nation's bicentennial in 1976. As I researched Stephen Betts, what I found out astounded me. I had never encountered such a prolific contributor to the American Revolution, except for perhaps a very high-ranking officer like General George Washington. But any research that I do has to adhere to DAR's exacting standards. It relies on primary source documents or secondary scholarly source materials. On this slide are the statements that I verified about Captain Betts, based on primary source materials like census records, legible gravestone photos, birth and death records, pension records, approved pension testimony, all dating back to his time on earth, 1756 to 1832. I want to note once again that before 1801, Canaan Parish was part of two other towns, 2/3 in Norwalk and 1/3 in Stamford. The Church of England Meeting House on West Road was part of Norwalk. It was part of Norwalk. The town of New Canaan was incorporated in 1801. So any research that we do before 1801 focuses on the records, books, archives from Norwalk and Stamford. The evening before the filming that you just saw, Father Justin contacted me to say that his own research had uncovered that Captain Betts was a slave owner. I researched to discover as much as I could, relying mostly on census records. And typically there's very little information regarding an enslaved individual. If they appear at all, it can often be as an X or a double X or a first name lacking a last name. So we were very fortunate to discover Jesse Betts through federal census records. A few words about the US federal census. The first federal census took place in 1790 and occurred every 10 years subsequent to that. The 1790 census was very rudimentary. Census takers were not given a writing implement or something to write on, nor were they given a template as to the information to collect. Oftentimes, census takers were barely literate themselves, so there were many errors. And as an example, Esther Betts Raymond, who is the captain's daughter, and her husband Lewis Raymond are listed in the 1840 census as residing in Westford. But the 1850 census lists them as residing in Westport. So it is more plausible to believe that they lived in Westport the entire time. Here's the information that I was able to gather and verify about Jesse. The 1850 census finally provides a name, and his name was Jesse Betts. So most of this was spoken about in the video. So I'm just going to highlight the things listed, underlined. So he was listed in the 1850 census as a farmer by trade. He is not, we don't know exactly whether he was the enslaved individual listed in Stephen Betts's household, because by the time a name is listed, he's a free man of color living in the household of Lewis and Esther Betts Raymond. So in 1860, now Lewis Raymond has passed away. And interestingly enough, now in the census that year, Jesse is listed not with the Betts last name, but with the Raymond last name. And the entire household consists of just Esther and Jesse. In the 1860 census, also importantly, there's an interesting notation where there's property listed next to Jesse's name, and then it's scratched out, and the only property owned is by Esther. So you can tell that some sort of discussion took place at that moment with the census taker about who could perhaps own property. So when Jesse passes away on December 12th, 1862 in Norwalk at the age of 78, he is buried in the St. Mark's Cemetery. But Esther Betts Raymond would have understood the importance of the captain, right, to St. Mark's. And I believe that she would have overseen what was placed inscribed on Jesse's gravestone, and she chose the last name of Betts. So it's important that we, and I want to ask the question, was Jesse Betts the enslaved individual listed in the 1790 census in Captain Stephen Betts's household? He would have been 6 years old in 1790. So we had a question mark about that. And then our most excellent sleuths, Brian Hollstein and Dick DePatie, discovered a 1792 Norwalk town record that revealed that Stephen Betts registered 2 children born to an enslaved woman in his household, and the enslaved woman was named Nancy. So the record stated that Nancy's son Pomp was born in 1785, and her son Bill was born in 1787, 2 years later. So as a result, it is more likely that 1790 census was listing Nancy as the enslaved individual in the Betts household, and that Jesse came to the Betts household subsequent to that year. But we don't know what happened to Nancy or her sons Pomp or Bill, unfortunately. So to me, even though we can't say definitively that Jesse was the enslaved individual of Captain Betts, I do see indications of a long-standing relationship. And those indications are these. First, that Jesse remained with the daughter Esther even once he was freed. And second of all, he is buried as Jesse Betts with the last name Betts, while Esther was still alive to oversee what was written on the gravestone. And third, he is buried with the Betts family in the St. Mark's Cemetery, in the same section, 2 gravestones down from the captain's. So it's important that we look at Jesse in the context of slavery in Connecticut. The slavery in Connecticut dates to the mid-1600s, and by the American Revolution, Connecticut actually had more enslaved Africans than any other colony in New England. Most resided in Fairfield, New Haven counties, and in the Hartford area. They were engaged in farming and seafaring near the ports, or in household duties as well. In 1784, the Connecticut General Assembly passed an act of gradual abolition, and it stated that those children born into slavery after March 1st, 1784 would be freed when they turned 25. So when we look at Jesse, when he would have turned, the census after which he would have turned 25, he was not freed. He was not freed for another 20 years. So what could that mean? That could mean that he was born, in January or February of that year, 1784, and he was never to be freed. And that is the terrible dynamic that was created by that act of gradual abolition, where half of the enslaved individuals were to be freed when they turned 25, and the other half were never to be freed. And I want to mention one thing too, that he was listed as someone of age 20 who could not read or write. It was very rare for an enslaved individual to be able to read or write. They would need somebody to teach them, and quite frankly, they were very busy. Also, some colonies, primarily in the South, enacted anti-literacy laws. South Carolina's anti-literacy law of 1740 formed part of, and these are in quotes, an act for the better ordering and governing of Negroes and other slaves in this province, end of quote. A set of laws adopted after a slave rebellion in 1739. In fact, those caught teaching slaves to read or write would be fined 100 pounds and face 6 months in jail. To an enslaved individual, being able to read or write was considered gold because it was so enabling. And now Brian Hollstein will present Bristol Bud.
In the video, a soldier of color named Bristol Bud was mentioned. It is thought that he was born in Southeast Connecticut. Bud was somewhere between the ages of 14 and 21 when in March of 1777, he enlisted as a private in the company of Captain Stephen Betts, part of the 2nd Connecticut Continental Regiment, commanded by Colonel Charles Webb of Stamford. It's likely that Bud was a slave when he signed on, though this is not certain. Slaves enlisting in Continental service, once they were allowed to enlist, were frequently promised their freedom if they agreed to serve until the end of the war. And that was how Bud enlisted. Bud's early life had either been spent as a household slave or a servant. Because of his skill in cookery and domestic duties, he spent much of his wartime working in the entourage of generals and other senior officers. What Captain Betts referred to in Bud's pension application as being attached to the family of a high-ranking officer. These officers sometimes impressed capable individuals into their personal service without regard to official orders. As a young private, Bud probably had little to say over who might detain him on such duties. And this led to difficulties when those officers were outside of his normal chain of command. Years later, when Bud went to apply for a war pension, this was the problem. He was listed as having gone AWOL, that's absent without official leave, in military records. But his words in the pension application stated that he had been pressed into service. With Captain Betts' written support, Bud secured a pension at age 57. By that time, he was blind and destitute and was being led around on a string by his 10-year-old son. Imagine traveling several hundred miles in that manner. The Journal of the American Revolution has a long online article about Bristol Bud. It's very interesting, and in case you wish to learn more about this stalwart individual.
Thank you, Brian. So now we're turning to Canaan Parish during the American Revolution. This is a chart that we compiled using Reverend Charles Selleck's 1896 book, cross-referenced with the 1790 census for Norwalk and Stamford. And it's essentially slave-holding clergy of any denomination in Norwalk and Stamford for 1790. And I just want to mention that spelling was not a thing back then. In fact, in an important document, you might have a last name spelled 2 or 3 different ways. So we have kind of matched these pieces of these data points up phonetically. So at the top, you see Reverend Matthew Burnett at the First Congregational Church in Norwalk. He was the owner of 2 slaves. Then George Ogilvie, Reverend George Ogilvie at St. Mark's Church in Norwalk was the owner of 1 slave. Reverend John Shepherd, we were uncertain of his affiliation, but he was the owner of 1 slave. And then at the end here is Reverend Ebenezer Dibble. He, in 1790, had 2 churches under his care, both St. Paul's Church in Norwalk and St. John's Church in Stamford. And he was the owner of 2 slaves. So if you could be so kind, please remember that name, Reverend Ebenezer Dibble. His name will come up in a few minutes. So in Connecticut, the majority of colonists wished to turn away from British rule. But there was a large segment of the Connecticut population, almost 1/3, that was horrified at the prospect of a break with England. They were concentrated in Litchfield, New Haven, and most particularly Fairfield County. These local colonists had reacted more conservatively during the furor of the Stamp Act. As the war unfolded, they were either forced to flee or remain silent. So this is a quote from Lois Bales, who was the New Canaan Historical Society historian in 1976. Basic to this conservatism was the predominance of the Church of England in Fairfield County. During the 1700s, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts actively pursued the establishment of the Church of England in Connecticut. Progress in most of Puritan/Congregationalist Connecticut was slow or non-existent. But in Fairfield County, the Anglican Church fitted well with the conservative political tendencies of the citizens. And by the Revolution, almost every town in the county had an Anglican church, some with missions in outlying areas like Canaan Parish. An important point to make is that not all Anglicans were Tories. There were exceptions like Captain Stephen Betts. But according to Bales, almost all Tories in the area were Anglican. Remember that all ministers received ordination in England, and prayers were said for the well-being of the king. Habits and loyalties were hard to break. A 1972 study by Bales of names, land records, and church records yielded the following breakdown for the population of Canaan Parish and their church affiliation. One of the documents she used was the visitation journal kept by the Congregational Church minister, Reverend Drummond, in December 1772. And this would have been the closest thing that existed to a census before 1790. The Church of England Meeting House on West Road had been constructed 8 years earlier. And so you can see, even within 8 years, the 21% of the population by family was attending the Church of England Meeting House on West Road. By 1775, 3 years later, the Anglican parish population was about 25% of the total Canaan Parish population, so it continued to grow. Parishioners were largely domiciled in the north central part of Canaan Parish, which is why the meeting house was located where it was on West Road. Whole families converted from Congregationalism to Anglicanism, and those who married into those families often converted too. Tories abounded in Norwalk, Stamford, and Canaan Parish. Tory was the term used in this region during the American Revolution for anyone who remained loyal to the English crown. They are sometimes referred to as loyalists or royalists. Eventually, many of these loyalists fled to Long Island or to Canada. A record exists through the Loyalist Claimants, a list of Americans who were reimbursed by the crown after the Revolutionary War for their losses in the United States. There were 70 claimants from Connecticut, and 31, more than half, were from Norwalk or Stamford. New Canaan Historical Society historian Bales, in her book, Canaan Parish and the American Revolution, published in 1976, used an informal local census from 1771 to show that about 1/4 of the male population of Fairfield County was Tory. She described the interconnectedness of Canaan Parish to Norwalk and Stamford. Family ties transcended parish lines. So what happened at Campo Beach, or cow pasture, now calf pasture, in Norwalk, at 5 Mile River, now Rowayton, at Goodwives River in Middlesex Society, now Darien, or at Shipham Point in Stamford affected all citizens of both towns. So if Captain Stephen Hoyt of Norwalk, an early and ardent loyalist, was called an infamous renegade, he was still a cousin to Sergeant Eustace Hoyt of the 9th Militia Regiment, who lived on the dirt road now known as Main Street in New Canaan. Of the 257 names of Norwalk and Stamford Tories, 38 were known residents of Canaan Parish. Looking back to the list I showed earlier of members of the local clergy who owned slaves in 1790, Reverend Ebenezer Dibble, rector of Stamford's St. John's Anglican Church, had a son, Fryler, who was an outspoken Tory and a local attorney who, among other things, created a petition in Stamford. The actual petition was never found, but it probably requested that Stamford stop arming soldiers to march against the British. Stamford residents signed the petition. The list of petition signers would have constituted a good list of Tory sympathizers in 1775. Of the 8 known signers, 5 eventually fled to Canada. A series of laws were passed by the Connecticut General Assembly against Connecticut Tories in December 1775 and June 1776. The latter law allowed local sheriffs to take possession of furniture and other possessions in Tory households and evict women and children living there. Most of the men had left for Long Island in spring of 1776. Reverend Dibble gave this account.
The flight of my eldest son, unhappy man, would to God I had died for him, about Christmas 1776. His house plundered, a wife and 5 children turned out, and myself obliged to take them in until spring and then sent off to him. Destitute of necessary bedding and clothing, not a grandson whom I would have kept permitted to stay, the clothing given to him taken from him. Friar Dibble was one of the leaders of the Stamford Tories who went to Nova Scotia after the war. The strains of conflict were too great for him, and after a year in Canada, he committed suicide. His wife, Polly Dibble, was burned out of her house in Stamford. In Canaan Parish, treatment of Tories was just as poor. William Wheaton owned a grist mill located along the east branch of the Mill River at West Road. His son, Ephraim, in his loyalist claimant testimony, attributed the death of his mother to cruel treatment she had endured by local enforcers of the 1776 law. Reverend Dibble was much esteemed and beloved in Stamford. So that may have accounted for the fact that he himself was not harmed during the war. He was attached to both St. Paul's Church in Norwalk and St. John's in Stamford. And after the war, staffing was in short supply by then, but he was still wealthy enough to have purchased and then provided ongoing necessities to 2 slaves. The holding of slaves in 1790 was still a legal act in Connecticut, although the gradual act of abolition had been enacted 6 years earlier.
Thank you, Brian. Upper middle class Connecticut families, including lawyers, government officials, clergymen, and businessmen, were able to afford the purchase of a slave or 2 to help out on the farm with household duties or with a business. By the American Revolution, one historian notes that half of all ministers in the colony and a third of all doctors were slave owners. Many Connecticut institutions were beneficiaries of the slave trade, including Yale University. Yale College's first professorship was endowed by Philip Livingston, one of the colony's biggest slave owners, while of its 12 residential colleges, 8 were named for slave owners. Among these were Ezra Stiles College, named after a prominent Congregationalist minister, slave owner, and in the latter part of his life, president of Yale College. Ezra Stiles invested with the merchants and sea captains of his Newport, Rhode Island congregation. In 1756, he sent a hogsmeade of rum along on a voyage to Africa and was repaid with a 10-year-old male slave whom he renamed Newport. Around the same time, he wrote a joint letter with fellow Newport minister Samuel Hopkins, condemning the great inhumanity and cruelty of slavery in the United States. In 1778, he was appointed president of Yale, a post he held until his death. Stiles freed his slave Newport in 1778 as he prepared to move to New Haven. He hired him 4 years later for $20 a year and indentured Newport's 2-year-old son until age 24. The enslaved in Canaan Parish during the American Revolution. The enslaved individuals present in Canaan Parish at the time that we could detect through research got caught in the political crossfire. Some were sold as their masters fled to loyalist territories. An example of this from Reverend Drummond's journal as quoted by Portraits of New Canaan book by Mary Louise King, it mentions Jonathan Husted, someone you might recall as being sold 2 acres in the same land transaction that made way for the meeting house construction on West Road. And this is in quotes. Jonathan Husted and William Bolton deeded the rocky sloping half acre, that is God's acre, to the people of Canaan Parish, not the church, on January 26, 1773. 3 days later, Reverend Drummond of the Congregational Church called on Jonathan Husted, who was the former captain of the train band. The Reverend called on Husted and his wife Mary at their home, now known as 16 West Road, noting in his journal that the other members of the household were 2 slaves, Candace and the child Onesimus, probably Candace's son. 6 days later, on February 4th, 1773, Captain Jonathan Husted sold his dwelling and considerable land to Moses Comstock and left Canaan Parish while his wife of 29 years went home to her aging father, Captain Ebenezer Carter. Carter promptly cut Husted out of any inheritance through his wife, and Husted seems to have gone to Brookhaven, Long Island. In a deed dated there on August 9, 1773, he sold Onesimus for 39 pounds to Moses Comstock's aunts, Sarah and Phoebe. There is no mention of what happened to Candace, but she was clearly separated from Onesimus through this transaction. Over to you, Brian.
Okay, Onesimus was 9 years old when he was sold to the Comstock sisters. By the burning of Norwalk in July 1779, 6 years later, Onesimus would have been age 15. His owner, Phoebe Comstock, spoke of the burning in this account from the 1976 Bales book, Canaan Parish and the American Revolution, published by the New Canaan Historical Society in 1976. And I quote, "The conflagration could be seen for miles. Phoebe Comstock was living on Ferris Hill. She reported that her father and 4 brothers had all gone to Norwalk at the first sound of the alarm guns. Early the next morning, she climbed an apple tree on the hill south of her home to watch the events of the dreadfulest day of her life. Looking off across the cleared farmlands, she could see the scurrying redcoats, hear the guns firing for a long time, and at the end, watch the steeple of the Norwalk Meeting House collapse in flames." This next piece, our source is from a service called Find a Grave. The last living slave in New Canaan, and arguably in Connecticut, was Onesimus Comstock. He was born in New Canaan in 1761, probably to Candace, who is listed as a slave of Jonathan Husted in the 1773 Visitation Journal. Onesimus died on November 17, 1857, 96 years of age. For 50 years, Onesimus never missed a Sunday in his pew at the Norwalk Congregational Church, riding there with Miss Phoebe Comstock astride one of her horses. In later years, he refused to be freed, and in the 1850 census, he declared himself to be a voluntary slave. At the end of his life, having been comfortably provided for, he returned to New Canaan to live and is buried near his home at the top of Ferris Hill. According to legend, in July 1779, Onesimus watched the burning of Norwalk from his vantage point atop a tree at the farm on Comstock Hill in Norwalk. There are records that he did participate in the revolution, and each year on Memorial Day, his grave is decorated with a flag. In fact, just parenthetically there, when Dick and I went by the grave site, there was a little flag right there. Now, there's stories of Onesimus diverting the British on that day, and even of him fighting in the Revolutionary War. He may have been with Phoebe's father and brothers, and perhaps been with the townfolks who harassed the British as they marched along East Avenue or West Avenue in Norwalk, or when the British crossed over from West Avenue on Cross Street. And today, that's where the Optimum News Channel 12 is located. And they were heading to where what was called the Battle of the Rocks took place, which was scattered, but 1 block north of the Lillian August warehouse store, which today is at France Street at Adams Street. There's no record of military service for Onesimus that we could find. He's said to have diverted British troops away from the battle. He then observed the destruction from Comstock Hill in Norwalk, or from the area that is now the Silver Mine Golf Course. Basically, there is a lot of lore surrounding Onesimus that we could not verify, but he did exist. He was attached to the household of Phoebe and Sarah Comstock for his life after age 9. We've seen his grave there. You can see it on the left in the Canoe Hill Cemetery at the back, far left edge, in a separate section that appears to be there for people of color.
Thank you, Brian. The Anglican Church after the burning of Norwalk. The Anglican minister Jeremiah Leeming had been at St. Paul's Church since 1758. During the early years of the war, Reverend Leeming continued to pray for the king as long as he dared to, according to local residents. Every man of his congregation were Tories, but people never molested such as did not commit any hostile act. Nathaniel Raymond of Old Well, which is South Norwalk, was quoted as saying, writing to the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, Leeming and 5 other members of the Anglican Church clergy in Connecticut called acts against the crown rebellion and warned their parishioners not to participate. Norwalk residents were infuriated by his ongoing literary defense of the crown and his opposition to Stamp Act misbehaviors. The Sons of Liberty, in fact, hung Leeming's portrait head down on a signpost and flung him into jail where he was injured, becoming lame for the rest of his life. After the burning of Norwalk, about 20 Tory families left with General Tryon for New York, including Reverend Leeming. Reverend Dibble was left to tend to both St. John's Church in Stamford and St. Paul's Church in Norwalk. Reverend Leeming was a slave owner, and his slave, Pomp, according to Connecticut Public Records, absconded and then asked for emancipation, which was granted to him that October. Leeming returned as a bare figure of a man 4 years later and was asked and declined election as Connecticut's first bishop. Norwalk was one of the first towns in Connecticut to build and maintain an Anglican church. Before the burning of Norwalk, both Stamford and Norwalk had strong Tory leanings, so it was surprising that the loyalist governor of New York, General Tryon, chose Norwalk as a target. Support for the Anglican Church dissipated to almost nothing overnight with the burning of Norwalk in July 1779. Not only in Norwalk, but in the town of Fairfield that had also been burned, and in Stamford and all of Fairfield County, including Canaan Parish. And with that, I turn over the question and answer to Father Justin. I will take down the slides.
Thank you so much, Lisa. As we reach the end of this first era of our exploration, I'm filled with awe at the meticulousness with which you all have gone about your work. So seriously, thank you so very much. I'm sorry that we're not in Morrill Hall so that you could hear a round of applause. But please know that we a virtual round of applause is coming out in our hearts here. And thank you also to Brian for your assistance presenting today. Today's presentation is on the longer side. We'll have more time for conversation next time. But we do have time for 1 or 2 questions here. So please don't be shy. Would invite you to raise your Zoom hand or put a question in the chat.
I think we wore him out.
Brian, go ahead.
If I can add just a little bit, we mentioned there that Stephen Betts had registered a couple of young boys, one of whom was Pomp. His name was Pump. This is new research is happening as we're sitting here. So that's kind of interesting. There was a man over in Norwalk who registered a runaway slave by the name of Pomp, P-O-M-P, which was fairly, pretty close to the time. He was a minister at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Norwalk. So that was kind of interesting, just to pick up. We of course can't show that for sure that this was the same Pomp who had been registered by Stephen Betts, but it sounds pretty good. I don't know if Lisa will allow that.
There, not to pop your balloon, but that was a very common name for an enslaved individual during that time. So sorry, buddy.
All right, there goes my balloon.
I'm a dream crusher.
This is an inside look at what the committee meetings have been.
Oh well.
Yeah, have a couple of questions here for me in the chat. Cindy Ty asks, do we know why Tryon burned Fairfield County? Lisa, I think that's a question for you.
Yeah, so I believe his overall goal was to try to draw General Washington out of the Hudson Highlands, and get him to bring him and his soldiers down to confront Tryon. And General Washington knew this, and so he didn't. There were requests for help when the burning of Norwalk was happening, and he did send some troops, but he wasn't going to move from his position in the Hudson Highlands because he knew it was a trick.
If I could add a little bit just from reading part of that, he was also, I don't know if it's the same incident, but he was headed to Danbury because Danbury was a depot for equipment for Washington.
Mm-hmm.
And he burned it.
Mm-hmm.
That's really interesting.
And subsequent to that was then the Battle of Ridgefield that took place, basically down their main street. And I don't know if you had a chance to visit the Keeler Tavern, but there's still a cannonball embedded in their side.
Right.
I was going to say that this is Stan Torty speaking. That's exactly right. That I drive by that all the time in Keeler's Tavern, and that's where the battle was. It's all part of this same scrimmage. And
what's really interesting about that is that the congregational minister there remained loyal to the crown, and but his parishioners, for the most part, turned patriot. So when they were in the Keeler Tavern, which was a watering hole at the time, when the Reverend would walk in, all conversation would stop because they were afraid of letting information leak to this the pastor, and it was a very, very difficult situation.
It's incredibly interesting. I have another question here. Sorry to just keep the conversation going, but I want to try to fit it in. The question's from Reverend Elizabeth, actually. Why would so many Congregationalists have become Anglicans in this period? And the question is whether or not it would have had anything to do with the political climate of the day. So was the decision to become an Anglican a kind of way to identify as a Tory? And then I think a question I would add on to that, Lisa, is did you find that there's any correlation between Tory identification and slave owning? That is it more likely that if you were a patriot, you would be less, you wouldn't have a slave, as opposed to if you were a Tory, you may have a slave, that kind of thing?
I kept finding that over and over again, where somebody who had Tory leanings seemed to be more accepting of the concept of slavery. And I can't tell you, how many times I saw somebody say, I don't believe in slavery, and yet they would own a slave. And that happened over and over and over again. And they typically had Tory leanings when, of one sort or another, or, Church of England, what have you, and have that I don't know. I think it goes back to the SPG. We'll have to, look at that for our timeline creation for next week, because I think that's, it is something I saw over and over again. Why would they turn to Anglicanism in Canaan Parish? A lot of times I think it was that they perhaps married into a family, where they were Anglican. So that's a huge draw. Also, if I were able to, whip up research right now at this moment, there was a moment in time where everyone, no matter what their religious tendencies were, paid taxes to the Congregational Church because they were the seat of government in Canaan Parish. So once that requirement was dropped, you did see folks kind of moving away from the Congregational Church because perhaps their religious sense was in a different direction. But I would need to kind of check the timeline on that just to verify.
Thank you, Lisa. That's incredibly rich. I really appreciate it. I can't resist drawing attention to the back and forth from our esteemed reverends here in the chat, talking about conversions from Congregationalism to Anglicanism. And I do have to say, this was a trend, for better or worse, with all of the caveats that Lisa just put in. My favorite one is in 1722, there was something called the Yale apostasy, where some Yale professors got together in 1722, and they had been secretly gathering in order to read the writings of the church fathers. And they come to the conclusion that they needed bishops. And so they all became apostates to the Congregationalists and became Anglicans. I mean, it's an hysterical story. In any case, just a few other notes here as we wrap up. Susan Boston is drawing our attention to the fact that this is the same General Tryon that started out in New Bern, North Carolina, and then built Tryon Palace prior to heading up to New York. Susan also is drawing people's attention to the incredible video of the showcasing of the research that's been done on the Canoe Hill Cemetery by Kristen Pace in our community. So there was some wonderful local press about Kristen Pace last week. I put that link up there in the chat, and thanks so much to Jill Ernst for pointing us to that. Thanks so much, Susan, for the reminder. And Zuhair here with, yes, a very interesting part of the puzzle here, England abolishing slavery before the United States did, which perhaps we're coming up to the Civil War here next time, so more on that next time. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Father Peter here for a last word and a blessing. Thank you all so much.
The only last word could be thank you, thank you, thank you to all of you. Oh my gosh, so rich and so enriching. Let us pray. Lord, we give you thanks for all of us and for all of it, and we give you thanks for narratives that come alive through time. We ask that we might join the ark, your ark, as we move toward a more whole and just and merciful society, knowing our past and living into our future. Inspire us that we might be fully alive in you and be your hands and feet and your thoughts and your prayers as we move forward to a more just society. We give you thanks in particular for all those who have done so much work here, for Lisa and for Dick and for Brian and Addie and for Justin, who enrich our lives beyond their knowing. We ask that you might be a blessing to us tonight as we move toward the end of our day, and may the Vesper light feed us as we put our heads on the pillow. Give thanks to the life that we have in you. And this we pray in the power of your Spirit. Amen. And I really wanted to get this done at 6 o'clock for Lisa. And at 6 o'clock, Lisa. Thanks, everybody. You're the best. Awesome.
Bye.